Okay, well, it's good to be with you guys again. I know I say that all the time. My name is Matt, if you don't know who I am. And this is Mary, my wife. And we're going to be bringing the message this morning. So, like I always say, it's good to be here every Sunday with the saints that make up Zion. Closer maybe? Okay. So we're going to be bringing a message today, and the message that, you know what, I'll turn my microphone on. There we go. I don't have to hold the mic today. I put it on and I forgot I had it on. So we're going to be bringing a message today. It's called The Shuffle and the Slingshot, and that'll make sense a little later. It is, the message we have today is a little bit related to some messages that we gave in the past. The last time Mary and I did this together, it was a message that we entitled, So We Got Some Sheep. So this message today is kind of tied to that message. It's not, it's not a part two or anything. And also, if you remember my New Year's Eve message that was entitled, Take Courage, Dear Heart. We talked about how, no matter what we're going through, no matter what we're facing in the year to come or what we face in the year behind us, we can know peace because we know that God is with us. And so we can take courage no matter what is in our future, no matter what is in our past. And so today's message is kind of tied to that. It is tied to our sheep. And just real quick, to give a sheep update.
Yes, we're going to give an update. We get asked now about two things, our kids and our sheep. So some of you have come to visit them, which is great. We put out the invitation again. If you would like to come meet them in person, they're still alive.
They are still living.
We're still learning to be shepherds. So here's Hannah with, of course, Helen and Olive. They're getting to know us quite well, and we with them. There they are in the snow in their little fold. And there they are. So they're doing great. We're looking forward to, as much as we love winter, we're looking forward to warmer weather where they get to graze more and do all that. So, still alive, there's the update. We wanted to just start with that. We've had a lot of people asking us. So, okay, now today the sermon is called, or the message is called, The Shuffle and the Slingshot. And we came across a story which inspired us. And we're going to read the story once we get into it here. We wanted to say where we got the story. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ann Voskamp, if that name sounds familiar. She's a really great teacher, writer. She's Canadian. She lives on a farm with her 7 children. She also recently became, she calls herself a shepherdess. I don't refer to myself that way, but she does. And she's written a lot of books, 1,000 Gifts, The Broken Way, Waymaker, all really great. And she's the type of person, if you're not familiar with her, when Anne says something, I listen, because I want to hear what she has to say. She is someone who is she just seems very close to God's heart. She's someone who has suffered a lot. Life's been very hard, even from her childhood. And she just, I don't know, she knows Jesus and her suffering, and he knows her in that suffering. So she's the one who shared this story, and we're going to get to that. But before we read the story and tell you about that, because in this story, we should say this too, as soon as we read this story, we immediately thought of a very well-loved story from the Bible, and that's really where we're going to spend probably most of our time, is in that story. But, so we're going to go there, but before we do that, we're going to have Jeremiah come and read our verses for the day.
All right, so today we are looking into Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. Therefore, since we also have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which is so easily entangles us. And let's run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking only at Jesus, the originator and perfecter of faith, who for joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Okay, so the story we're going to read. This is a story. Has anyone ever heard of Cliff Young? Does that name sound familiar to anyone? Some of you might be thinking of the music group, if anyone thought it came as cool. Not that Cliff. This is a man, he's Australian, and he did something very amazing in 1983 when Matt and I were very young kids. What'd you say? Yes. And he was a farmer. He was, I think, one of 6 kids. He did not, he was not married. He lived with his mother, and they had sheep on their farm. They also had cattle. And he ran an ultra marathon. And we're going to tell you the story of how this happened. He just showed up to run this ultra marathon. So listen to this story. So his name was Cliff Young. And although he wasn't actually that young anymore, he was about 61 years old, he was a farmer. And he showed up for a race in his overalls. This was after they had him change into this. And his work boots on with galoshes over top. And he wore those just in case it rained. He had no Nike sponsorship. He had no wife. He lived with his mother on his family's farm. He never ran in any kind of race before. He never ran a 5-mile race or a half marathon, not even a marathon. But there he was, standing in his work boots at the starting line of an ultra marathon, the most grueling marathon in the world, a 544-mile marathon. They don't measure races like that in yards, they measure it in zip codes. This is Ann's posting of this, by the way. First thing that Cliff did was he took out his teeth. This is how long the race was here. This is Australia. So he went from, what is it there? Westfield down to there. So he took out his teeth because he said when he ran, they rattled. He grew up on a farm with sheep that had no 4-wheelers and no horses. So the only way to round up the sheep was on the run. And he told them, whenever the storms would roll in, I'd have to go run and round up the sheep. 2,000 sheep on 2,000 acres of land. Sometimes I'd have to run those sheep for 2 or 3 days. I can run this race. It's only 2 days more. 5 days. I've run my sheep for 3. The reporters shoved their microphones around old Cliff and asked, do you have any sponsors? Because runners always had sponsors. Cliff slipped his hands into his overall pockets and said no. It looked like he wouldn't be able to run without sponsorship. No one took him very seriously, and he seemed harmless and was almost amusing to people. So in the end, they allowed him to run. And the race began, and the other runners, all under the age of 30, so Cliff was more than twice their age, took off like a shot from the starting line. And scruffy old Cliff staggered forward. He didn't run, but rather he shuffled, more like it. Straight back, arms dangling, feet awkwardly shuffling along. And Cliff ate dust at first. For 18 hours, the racers blew down the road, far down the road, and old Cliff just shuffled on behind. Come the pitch black of night, and the runners in their expensive running shoes laid down by the roadside to sleep, because that was the conventional plan to win an ultramarathon, to run 544 straight miles. You ran for 18 hours, slept for 6, and then you repeated that for 7 days. The darkness fell in, and the runners slept, and the cameras got turned off, and all the reporters went to bed. But yet, through the black night, one 61-year-old man, far, far behind the others, kept shuffling on, one foot in front of the other. Cliff ran on through the dark because he didn't know you were supposed to stop. He had no idea that the accepted way professional runners approached an ultramarathon race was to run 18 hours, sleep for 6, for 7 days straight. But Cliff Young didn't know that. He didn't know the accepted way. He only knew what he did regularly back home, the way he always had done it. You run on through the dark. It turns out that when Cliff Young said he gathered sheep around his farm for 3 days, he meant he'd run across 2,000 acres of farmland for 3 days straight without stopping or sleeping, without the dark ever stopping him. That's how you gathered sheep. So, along the endless stretches of highway, a tiny shadow of an old man shuffled along, 1 foot after another, right through the heat, right through the night, and Cliff gained ground. Cliff gained ground because he didn't lose ground to the dark. Cliff gained ground because he kept on pressing through the dark. And somewhere at the outset of the night, Cliff Young in his overalls, he shuffled past the younger, trained, toned runners, and by the morning light, he was a tiny shadow far, far ahead of the professional athletes. For 5 days and 15 hours and 4 minutes straight, he ran, never once stopping. Never stopping until the old sheep farmer crossed the finish line first. He crossed the finish line first, beating the world record by 2 whole days. The second place runner crossed the finish line 9 hours after he did, with that steady, slow shuffle of his. The shuffle of Cliff Young would become known worldwide in running circles as the Cliff Young Shuffle, or the Ultra Shuffle, the unconventional way you run an ultramarathon. A way of moving that can keep on going and going, a way of running that doesn't overexpend energy, that allows runners to maintain a steady pace for long distances without exhausting their leg muscles. When they handed Cliff his $10,000 prize for winning, he said that he didn't know there was a prize. He said he'd just run for the wonder of it, and said that all the other runners had worked hard too, and so he waited at the finish line, and he handed each of the runners an equal share of the $10,000 until the prize was gone. And then the farmer in boots walked away without a penny for the race. When the reporters asked him after the race what had kept him going through the nights, he said this: "I just imagined I was out running a storm to gather up my sheep." So here's Cliff. There he is running through his fields. There he is, having won the race. So we heard this story and we were just like, wow, okay. There seems to be a lot to think about with this story. So much.
So, you know, one of the things that kind of stands out, and a point that Ann Voskamp made, was that, you know, Cliff learned this shuffle in like his everyday life. There was nothing, am I not? Okay. There was nothing, he was not, okay. This was an ordinary thing. Oh, am I not coming through? Okay, this was a very ordinary thing that Cliff did. I mean, he ran for 3 days straight on the farm, chasing his sheep and cattle. This was nothing, you know, if you think about it, running like that, there's nothing exciting about that. It's pretty dull. And you probably begin to feel kind of silly. It's very sacrificial. He was serving his mom and the farm and the sheep. You know, he was just living his life. You know, he didn't learn to shuffle, you know, so that one day he could win an ultra marathon. That probably was never in his mind. In fact, this ultra marathon, it was the first one. They had never had it before in that. You know.
And the story goes that he heard about it and thought, I think I should do that.
Right, it's just 2 more days. You know, it's 2 more days more than what I normally do. He did it to take care of his sheep. You know, he was faithfully doing this already.
With what he was given to do,
Right.
caring for the
You know,
sheep.
he did it to take care of the sheep. You know, and Ann Voskamp made the point, she said this, she said, sometimes the best training for the really big things is just the everyday things. The race isn't won by big resolutions, but by the slow and steady rhythms, the ordinary, quote, shuffle of doing the next hard and holy and small thing will win everything in the end. So we were, you know, when we heard this story, we were so struck by this story. It's amazing. I've done a little bit of running in my life, and I know what it takes to run. I mean, it's like, this is amazing that someone can
After
run.
we heard this story, I was like, Matt, can you run like 3 miles? And then we were like, can we run 3 minutes? You know,
The furthest I ran at one point was 7 miles, and that was a lot of years ago.
But we do all have shuffles in our lives.
Right.
We're not sheep farmers. I mean, we have sheep, but we don't consider ourselves sheep farmers. But I can think of ways where I would say, oh, that's my shuffle. You know, that's kind of my ordinary thing that I'm practicing, learning to do and be, just like Cliff learned to do that.
And those things, you know, these are like the everyday things that we practice, like in our relationships, in our homes, in our workplace, in our community, in our friends, with our friends. You know, it's like the everyday shuffling through life of doing the next hard, as Ann said, the next hard and holy thing. It's not big and glamorous, but, you know, like she said, it's the small things that will win everything in the end.
And we all have, you know, Cliff ran on through the dark. We all are doing this through darkness, through difficulty. All of us. For him, it was literally darkness and the storms that were coming. And then in this race, you know, he had to think back to what he did on the farm to be able to do the race. So we all have that. We all have to keep shuffling on.
It might look different in my life or your life, but we all have the hard things, you know, that we have to kind of walk through and shuffle through. And of course, this reminded us, as we're looking at this, it reminded us of a story.
I'm curious, now that you know that, does anyone know what the Old Testament story is that this made us think of? Does anyone want to venture a guess? There's a clue in the title of our sermon. The Slingshot. David and Goliath. Indeed, we thought of this right away. For some reason, Cliff's shuffle made us think of David's slingshot. So we're going to look at this story because it's one of those things. I don't know that I've read the story in a long time, like actually from here. Like I know the story, like, oh, David, but wow, there's a lot in it that we forgot or maybe never knew, you know, things that were in it. So anyway, we're gonna spend a lot of time here now on this.
Yeah, so, you know, like Mary said, this is a story that we always loved as kids. You know, I still love the story as an adult now. But it's a story of a shepherd boy, you know, who, you guessed it, Noah, was really good with a slingshot. And this story is in 1 Samuel 17, chapter 17. And, you know, David was a shepherd. And it was a very thankless job tending his father's sheep. He took care of his father's flocks. And there was a reason why he was good with a slingshot. You know, it's not because David sat around, you know, having target practice, thinking like, I'm going to get really good with this thing, so someday I can be the hero and slay a giant. I mean, maybe he did actually practice with it, but there was lots of practice to be had without the practice, because there was wild animals who would regularly come to feed on the sheep. Sheep are very, very prone to predators. They're completely helpless. So they're an easy target. You know, he would be protecting the sheep. We know from the story that he would be protecting the sheep, and then very often it would end up with him protecting himself from the wild animal as he tried to protect the sheep. And then he was actually anointed as king of Israel, okay?
While he was tending sheep.
While he was tending his sheep. And I think as the story goes, Samuel comes and he looks at all of Jesse's sons and he says, well, do you have any more? And they bring David in from the field and he is anointed as king, and he goes back to the sheep.
Right, after he's anointed for king, or as the king. And then Saul, meanwhile, there's a very interesting passage. We're not going to get into it, but in 1 Samuel 16, by the way, this story is in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to kind of be reading parts of it because it's long. If you want to turn to it, you don't have to, but if you'd like to. 1 Samuel 17. But so Saul, David is called to come and be with Saul because it says the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and he's actually tormented by another spirit. And when David would come and play his music, it says Saul would be refreshed, and he would, you did say the spirit, I forget, the spirit, the harmful spirit would depart from him. So David was made his armor bearer, because Saul was still the king, even though David was anointed the king, and he would go back and forth. Well, meanwhile, here comes the big bad Philistines, who set up their lines within the land of Israel, and they were looking to conquer. They were warriors.
Yes.
And they were looking to conquer. So you have the Philistines setting up their battle line and the Israelites setting up their battle line. And Goliath.
Right. So while these battle lines are being drawn, of course, the Philistines have this hero, if you will. His name was Goliath, and from not just the accounts in the Bible, but there's others. He was somewhere around like 9 feet some inches tall. He was a big guy, and he was bad, and he was mean, and he would come out morning and evening, and he would taunt the Israelites. He would threaten them. He would make fun of their God. He'd be like, hey, why don't you guys come out and fight me? He would make fun of them. He was mocking Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Now, so David's back home watching the sheep, or he's helping at times be the armor bearer for Saul. And some of David's brothers were there. And David, it says in the story, David was going back and forth between his father's flocks and these battle lines, taking, I think, often being the armor bearer and also taking provisions. So he was feeding his father's sheep, and then Jesse at one point tells him, this is in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 17, Jesse sends some provisions with them. I think
some bread and 10 cheeses.
Cheese.
A detail I didn't remember. But
these warriors needed food, So David returned to the battle lines, and it says, there's one thing really interesting about this story is that the sheep keep getting mentioned
over and over
again, like about how he was taking care of his father's sheep. Well, now this time he leaves with the cheese and the bread, and he leaves the sheep under the eye of the caretaker. Yeah. Just make sure the sheep are being watched. Don't worry. So David gets into camp, and he happens to hear these taunts of Goliath. And it does not sit well with him at all.
Yeah, David says, who is this guy who is defying the armies of the living God? And he asks his oldest brother this, and his oldest brother says, who's taking care of Dad's sheep? That's what he said. Who's taking care of our father's sheep?
Flocks?
Like, what are you saying this for? Because his brothers and all the other men of Israel that David is asking this question to, they're not willing to go.
They're afraid to go fight Goliath. And I think David's very forthright and unafraid questioning, I think, was kind of pricking. So he asks his brother, and his brother's like, what are you doing here? And who's taking care of Dad's sheep? And then he goes and asks some other people, and he gets the same response. Like, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here.
And so then David says, okay, no one else will do it? I'll do it. He said, I'll go. And Saul says, no. He says, you can't do this. And he says here,
in
verse
verses
34
through 37.
Yeah, because Saul says, you were not able to go fight with him. You're but a youth. And he says, Goliath's been a man of war from his youth. Basically, you're going to get slaughtered if you go out there. And this story has a lot of very graphic things we're not going to be reading, but the destruction talked about is very extensive and thorough, which I don't remember that either. And it's not included in many of the children's tales about this. But, so anyway, so after Saul has said no, David says this. And this just blew us away. This is what he said. He said, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him, and I delivered it from his mouth. And if he rose up against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Amen. And Saul said to David, okay, go, and the Lord be with you. So he must have convinced him. And then he tried on his armor. They tried Saul's armor on David.
Yeah, and David's like, I can't do this. I haven't tested this out. This isn't going to work. And we know the story, that he went.
So then, these very familiar verses. So, He says here, and I'm sorry, I want to make sure I read this. So he goes down, here it is. He took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached Goliath. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David. And when he saw him, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in his appearance. And he said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And he said, "Come to me, and I will destroy you." And then David said, "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down." He goes on to talk about what he's going to do, and he says, and this will happen, all the assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And as the story goes, David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell to the ground. And he was defeated. We'll stop there.
So why did the story of Cliff Young make us think of this story of David? I think it's because David was himself in these times of working for his father, taking care of the sheep. He was doing his shuffle, if you will. He was just being faithful to the sheep, being faithful to his father.
His slingshot was his shuffle.
Yeah,
right?
His slingshot, his ability to protect the sheep, to take up for these sheep and to protect them, that's analogous to what Cliff was doing on his 2,000-acre farm in Australia for his mother and for his family, running after shuffling after the sheep. He was protecting the sheep. He was risking his own life. He was obeying his father. He didn't become good with the slingshot, like I said a little while ago. He didn't become good with the slingshot because he knew that he was going to have a meeting with Goliath, or that he was going to decide a battle in single combat. He did this because he was caring for the sheep and also protecting himself from death.
Yeah.
And, his doing that, he was practicing his shuffle. Ann Voskamp had this to say in this blog post that she made. She said, the best training for the really big things in life is just the everyday things. It's just the everyday things.
We're going to pivot here a little bit. And because we're not just saying that we all need to be faithful with our shuffle and our slingshot, whatever that is. Yes, that's true, but there's more to it. And David, the story of Cliff doesn't take us there, but the story of David does. And so we want to kind of take this down a level to really what's going on. Because here's the thing, the heart that David had as a shepherd, that is what largely shaped him, his heart as a king. It's what he learned in the pastures. He knew how to be a sheep and a shepherd. Remember, this is the guy who wrote the 23rd Psalm, right? He was a man after God's own heart, and here is the point. It's not just that David was good with the slingshot, it's that he knew the good shepherd. That's the thing. So as much as these stories, like we said, they are significant, we do need to be faithful with whatever we're shuffling through, whatever our slingshot is, absolutely. That's not the main point, though. That's not the main point.
And it's because of this. David stood before Goliath. He stood there on that battle line because he knew, not because he was like, I can do this because I'm good with my slingshot. Okay?
He didn't trust his own skills.
He didn't trust in his own skills. He didn't trust in his slingshot. He stood there because he trusted in God. And he was very certain of God's protection, God's faithfulness. It was God's deliverance. In fact, when he's talking to Saul and he's describing how he killed bears and lions with his bare hands, if you listen carefully there, it's God is the reason. God delivered me from these animals. So when he was standing there, that very trust in God is what made him a great king.
Right, it wasn't killing Goliath.
It wasn't killing Goliath. That's not what made him a great king.
It was that he trusted and he followed God, and he did that in spite of his many mistakes. David was a man, he was a man after God's own heart, really spoken of as no one else really in the scriptures are, other than Jesus himself. And yet,
he was a very flawed man, but what made him a great king is that he trusted and followed Yahweh. He followed his God as much as he could, and that's what made God then said of him, he's a man after my own heart.
so yes, practicing our shuffle, using our slingshot, whatever that is, that's important. We grow as God's children when we do those things. We learn, we learn about the character of Christ in us, and we learn how to love others, and we learn how to walk in forgiveness, receiving God's forgiveness, and giving his forgiveness. All those things are really important, and we have to learn how to keep shuffling through the darkness and difficulties in our lives.
Yeah. And we don't know, when we're going to have one of these like big, remarkable moments in our lives.
When a Goliath or an ultra-marathon
right,
might spring up for us.
But again, like that's not the point.
Right.
There's a value and a beauty to like dying to ourselves daily and practicing like the way of Jesus. It's like learning how to love, how to forgive, how to practice patience and kindness and self-control. It's like the fruits of the Spirit. There's a shuffle to learning those things in life as we move through life, putting one foot in front of the other. There's always difficult things, circumstances, relationships, where it's hard to do those things. But that's where we learn. And then when those big times come, yes, we're ready for them. But that's not the point. The point is the day-to-day.
Well, the point is also, yes, and the point is the trust that David spoke of, the trust and the following. And we're going to go back to finish up here. We're going to go back to where Jeremiah read from in Hebrews 12, because this is the main point. And we're going to finish here talking about Jesus. And it says here, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Jesus did this. He's our older brother. He's the firstborn of the new creation. He shuffled his way right to his big moment, which was the cross, where he actually did trust God entirely with his very life. He crossed that line over to death, trusting that God would raise him up.
He kind of like faced the ultimate darkness,
Right.
the darkness of death. Like David before Goliath, Jesus did that because he knew his father. David knew God so well, he completely trusted him.
And Jesus did.
And Jesus did too. Jesus trusted his father, the good shepherd, and he trusted him absolutely with his very life. And Jesus was filled with his love, and Jesus was love. It's like Jesus was the God of love, and yet he was man. It's just a mystery, and yet Jesus could shuffle his way to that cross because he knew the Father.
And so as we're learning what it means to be a child of God, as we're learning to be loved by God, and to let him grow us and change us, and we often are learning those in our shuffles, in our everyday faithfulnesses. As we're learning those things, let us remember, though, that we're looking really to Jesus, who's the one who authored and perfected our faith. And so this isn't a thing that's on our own strength. It wasn't David's skill with the slingshot that slayed the giant. It was his trust in God that slayed the giant. Yes, his stone did, and it was important that he kind of did his part, but it was God. We talk about farmers, and we have a garden. It doesn't usually go very well, but we try. Every year we put seeds in that garden. There is nothing that we can do. We can water it, We can't control the weather. We cannot make those seeds germinate. We can plant them and be faithful to do that. But God has made the miracle that happens in a seed when it sprouts. And it's the same in our lives. And we have to trust for that, just like we have to trust God and we look to Jesus for that. It's His work in us. He's the one who makes us new.
That's right. Yeah.
You know. So before we have Jeremiah come up, we thought, since we spent so much time talking about David, I'm not sure what you have planned, Jeremiah. What did you say? You go with what you have. We are actually going to read. We thought it'd be neat to finish our time here with some words from David himself. This is a psalm that he wrote, and it's, when we were reading this today, in light of everything we've talked about here, he can say it far better than we ever could.
So in the ESV here, this Psalm 25 is entitled, Teach Me Your Paths. And this psalm is ascribed to David. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust. In you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. They shall be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous. Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for the sake of your goodness, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right, and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness, for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him. He makes known to them his covenant. His eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. O guard my soul and deliver me. Let me not be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. My integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles.
So no matter what we're shuffling through, the answer really isn't to shuffle harder. But the answer is, yes, be faithful, but the answer is to trust in God, because it's really God, it's God's work, it's his strength, it's his redemption, you know, and it's in our weakness, like Paul talked about, his strength is somehow made perfect. You know, that miracle is worked in each of us. So I hope that's encouraging to you guys, because we're all shuffling through something. We all have
going through something.
But God is faithful.
Yes, he is. And we can trust him. He is good.
Jeremiah is actually, I think, going to come and do our benediction for us.
Can you show us the shuffle?
The shuffle? We did watch a video. You can look this up if you want to see the Click Young shuffle.
I want to see the shuffle.
But you know what's amazing? This is fascinating. We watched a video from, I was thinking of the Wallies because they're doing marathon running. I don't think you've done an ultra marathon, right? Or have plans to, okay. But there was a running expert who was saying that when you're just running, like people couldn't figure out how to do the shuffle. Like it was something he learned in this, you know, need to round up the sheep. So it's been hard to imitate it in just the context of running, which is interesting. So anyway. Matt could try. I'm gonna try to show. It's kind of like
I did not watch these videos that you watched.
Okay.
All right. I found it fitting as I was looking through scripture last night to finish up here with Hebrews 13, the author's benediction to those who are listening. Verse 20. Now the God of peace, who brought up from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep through the blood of the eternal covenant, even Jesus our Lord, equip you in every good thing to do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen.